Welcome again to the Diplomatic Lounge. Last episode we started out at the United Nations and then we got into some discussion about state and society. But I feel that I have much more to share about the UN and we will go there again for this episode too. Now, when I started to work in New York at the UN in 1985, I had already worked in Ethiopia and my family and myself had lived in Jamaica after that. So in Jamaica we had a certain credibility with the Rastafarian society because we had transitioned from the motherland to the Caribbean. And through a series of coincidences, we got to know and became close with some of the family of Bob Marley, who was already deceased. Now, I knew, like everybody else, that one of Bob Marley's most famous songs, War, is supposedly based on a speech the Emperor Haile Selassie had given at the United Nations. I gladly took Bob's words for it, but since I always like to check out things for myself, once I was in New York, I went to the archives and started looking for the original document. Now, these days that would probably be done digitally, but I still had a bit of the thrill, the boyish thrill of treasure hunting when I found this document. Indeed, here it is. Friday, October the 4th, 1963, 3 p.m. Haile Selassie speaking at the 1229th plenary meeting of the General Assembly. It was an important speech, and that is actually the exception, because as I've hinted already previous week, when you're sitting there in that hall and you listen to the close to 200 speeches that you have to undergo, there are moments of pretty massive boredom. Not all of the speakers are gifted. Most of them read a text they have not written themselves, and very few dare to improvise. But when your turn comes to speak from that podium, you cannot help but be impressed, first of all, by the space. You're looking out at this enormous hall, by the idea that this was supposed to be a focal point where world politics would be discussed, where hopefully conflicts would be prevented, etc. And of course by the fact that many illustrious speakers, other than the humdrum that you undergo there daily, have stood there as well. Haile Selassie in 1963 being, of course, one of them. The text used by Bob Marley is indeed there. It's here on paragraph 27 of the document. Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, and so on. So here it is. But it struck me, apart from this famous quote, that the Emperor's speech was cautiously optimistic about the state of the world. Now, that month of October 1963 was about a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the reality of nuclear war had been upon us, or the threat of nuclear war at least had been upon us. But in the summer following the missile crisis, there had been a number of hopeful developments. To begin with, President Kennedy had given his famous speech on world peace and disarmament at American University in June. Even more importantly, in August, the first ever nuclear test ban treaty had been signed between the US and the Soviet Union. And Kennedy himself had also indicated more hopeful initiatives when he spoke himself at the UN in September. There was even more follow-up in the White House. In October, there was a secret memorandum that would have withdrawn the US from the Vietnam War in 1965 if Kennedy were to be re-elected in 1964. So Haile Selassie's speech came in the middle of those hopeful signs. Hopes were completely dashed a few weeks later. November 22, President Kennedy was assassinated. Without going into all the conspiracy theories, about the assassination, it's clear that US foreign policy changed dramatically after Kennedy disappeared. The Cold War was back to its original footing and would last for another almost 30 years. And even more importantly, instead of withdrawing from Vietnam, the US got deeper and deeper involved under Presidents Johnson and Nixon, with the well-known consequences. And so we had this brief window where the world was looking at a somewhat more optimistic evolution, which was underscored by Emperor Haile Selassie in that famous speech in October 1963. The man spoke with great moral authority. He was still to rule for another 11 years. He was deposed in 1974. And while he was still firmly in control, there was, of course, already some resistance in Ethiopia against his rule, because, after all, he was a man that had come straight out of the Middle Ages and had modernized the country at a pretty high speed. But in the UN, he spoke with great moral authority because he had been the first victim of fascism during the Second World War in 1935-36, when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. And so he was well placed to warn against the risks of war, overarmament, etc. That brief window did not make much difference. The Cold War lasted. Vietnam went on. And yet, we cannot have a great respect for that man who spoke from personal experience, knew what war was like, knew what exile was like. And it's almost sad that we don't have a similar voice today with a similar kind of moral authority to warn against the risk that politicians playing with fire impose on the world today. We will stay at the UN for the next episode, and then I will comment on another famous day, one that I lived myself as a direct eyewitness. In 1963, I was 11, so I was obviously not there. And also one that had great impact on our lives even till today. So hope to see you again next time. Till then, thank you and take care.